Hello everyone, good afternoon, and welcome to Savvy Central Radio. This is your host, Christina Nitschman. Each week on Savvy, we host new individuals and business owners, inviting them to share their wisdom, expertise, dreams, and lessons learned in their field of business. Our guest today is Sergeant-at-Arms Brian Anderson. He joins us today to share the amazing history of the Doolittle Tokyo Raiders. They were the first U.S. air retaliation attack for the attack on Pearl Harbor. Brian will also share with us how we can help commemorate these amazing men who helped protect and serve our nation. Well, I am so excited to have everyone out here today. Sergeant-at-Arms Brian Anderson is also joining us. Now, mind you, everyone, this is a live call, so you can call in and speak to us if you have a question. I might have to put you on hold while we finish talking, but I'll answer your questions. You can call into 718-664-6303. I'm also going to open the chat room so you can dial in to Blog Talk Radio, go to our chat room, and write in your questions there. Thank you, Brian, for coming on out today to talk to us about this amazing topic that I, frankly, wasn't very well aware of.
Well, thank you, Christina, for having me on board today on this eve of the 72nd anniversary of the attack on Pearl Harbor. Oh, as you had already previously mentioned, the attack on the Japanese mainland, April of 42, only 3.5 months after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the planning was a direct result because President Roosevelt wanted some action, and he wanted to be able to show the Japanese that we could reach them, we could pay them back.
Yes, and I understand you're doing amazing work right now because you're working to get the Senate to vote on a bill authorizing the Congressional Gold Medal be awarded to the 4 remaining members of the Doolittle Tokyo Raiders?
Well, we have 4 that are still with us, and we're asking for 6 medals, 1 for each of the 4 that we still have. We had a 5th Raider, Tom Griffith, who was with us until February 26th of this year, and that was the night that Senator Brown introduced the legislation. Senator Brown of Ohio introduced the legislation for the Congressional Gold Medal for the Raiders in the Senate. So we're asking for 1 still for his family and a 6th medal to hang in the Air Force Museum in Dayton, Ohio, to represent all the Raiders.
Fill the audience in a little bit about this history of the Doolittle Tokyo Raiders and the significance of their contribution during World War II.
Oh, I would be happy to do that, Christina. Well, some of you may already know the history, but we're going to go ahead and kind of get you started here. As we already have mentioned, after the attack on Pearl Harbor, President Roosevelt wanted some way of showing the Japanese that, hey, we can get you. We're going to get you. And it was a Navy captain by the name of Lowe who was flying over Norfolk, and he looked out the window, and he saw an airstrip, but next to the airstrip were some aircraft carriers parked. He started formulating an idea, got the idea, well, maybe we could launch a bomber off an aircraft carrier. So that idea was run up the chain. It made it all the way up to the president. He liked the idea. He contacted General Hap Arnold, and General Arnold knew the only person that could carry this off, make it successful, was going to be, at that time, Lieutenant Colonel Jimmy H. Doolittle. What a lot of people don't know is General Doolittle had a degree from MIT in aeronautical engineering, and some of the instruments that we still use today for flying in bad weather, the general helped develop those back in the day. So he was pretty savvy. So the task was given to him, and he looked at 3 different Army bombers, and he came up with the selection of the B-25, the North American B-25 named the Billy Mitchell. And he needed crews, so he looked around, and there wasn't a lot of B-25s out there at the time. Remember, this was early 1941. The aircraft hadn't been out all that long from the manufacturer. So he found the 17th Bomb Group seemed to have the most experience and the most time on that aircraft. So somebody in the orderly room posted a memo, volunteers wanted, dangerous mission. So these guys saw that, and they signed their name to it. They had no idea, no clue what the mission was, what they were going to have to do. They just saw the posting, volunteers needed for a dangerous mission. So the guys signed up. So they left from out in Oregon. They went to South Carolina, did some stuff there, and then they took off to Eglin, Florida. At that time, it was not a very big base like it is today, but they had a Navy gentleman there that was going to show these guys and teach them how to take off on a short field. Now, understanding the Raiders still don't know what the mission is. They don't know what they're going to have to do. All they know is that the airplanes have been souped up. They've had some modifications done to the engines, and they've taken weight out of the aircraft. They've added extra fuel tanks and stuff. But again, so these guys they're looking at this, and 300, 400 feet? Come on, give me a break. But they went through the training, they got it done, and again, at this point, they still have no idea what's going on, what the mission is. The day finally came when they had to fly to the West Coast, and the general told them, fly across the country, do some low-level flying, buzz things, and make it good, get some good practice in here. So they flew out to the West Coast, San Francisco. They landed at Alameda Naval Base, and once they checked in, and the general was there to ask them, is your airplane okay? And they said yes, and they were told to taxi it over to this big gray ship that was parked over there at the dock. And that big gray ship was the brand spanking new USS Hornet CV-8. And these sailors are looking at these Army Air Corps jockeys, and they're like, we don't want to be a taxi cab for these guys. We want to get to war. Let's go do something. So there was not real bad feelings, but there was some animosity between the Army and the Navy here. And again, this was the very first time, Christina, that the Army-Navy had a joint operation going. Again, some of the guys went down and had a night in San Francisco. There's pictures of the guys being at the top of the mark. I guess at the time that was the hotel to go to for a meal, and was how they spent their last night in the USA before they took off on a mission that they still don't know where they're going and what it's all about. So they sailed the next day underneath the Golden Gate, got out into open seas, and that's when Lieutenant Colonel Doolittle and Admiral Michener gave the announcement and explained to them what the mission was. Well, at that point, now the Navy guys loved the Army Air Corps guys, because they were all excited now. They were their best buddies. They'd help them do anything that they wanted. But now they knew that they were in a fight together. So the plan is that they were going to get within X amount of miles and launch the aircraft. It was going to be, they were going to take off at dusk, and then the general was going to have some incendiaries on his aircraft because General Doolittle was going to be the first aircraft off, and with the incendiaries, the thinking was, we'll make some fires, and that would help guide the rest of the airplanes in. So what happened was, on the morning of April 18th, they were spotted by some Japanese picket ships, and they radioed on them, and they were afraid that these guys, that their secrecy had been compromised. At 7:30 that morning on April 18th, they're down in the chow hall, standing waiting for chow or eating, and all of a sudden at 7:45, it's Army pilots, man your aircraft. So they went and grabbed all their stuff. A matter of 15 minutes, they're grabbing their stuff. Navy guys are putting extra fuel cans on the deck, trying to get these guys ready to go. The USS Nashville is starting to shoot at these Japanese picket ships because they don't want them to get any radio messages off to Tokyo and let Tokyo know that, hey, there's an aircraft carrier out here. So because they were spotted early, the Raiders had to leave 200 miles before they had planned to. The plan was they were going to leave the carrier, attack their 5 different cities in Japan, and then fly on to Kunming in China. Well, and that would have worked out pretty well, they think, had they been able to launch at the launch point. But now they're leaving early. So there's probably a pretty good a good chance that they're not going to have the gas to get to where they have to go. They're probably going to have to bail out over occupied Japan or possibly occupy China and become captured. But the guys still went. None of them backed down. They knew what the mission was. And remember, none of these guys had ever taken an aircraft off of an aircraft carrier before.
Wow.
So they still had that hurdle to overcome. Well, at 8:07 that morning, the command was given, prepare to launch. At 8:15, aircraft number 1, General Doolittle and Richard E. Cole, co-pilot, they took off to start the heroic mission where they flew into destiny. All 16 aircraft took off. The 16th aircraft had a little mishap. One of the Navy sailors slipped into the prop and lost his arm that morning. The guys on aircraft 16, they didn't know any better because there was no communication back with the ship. They thought they'd killed the guy. And it wasn't until after the war, when some of those guys came back, that they found out that the sailor had lived. I met one of the sailors on the USS Hornet. He's no longer with us, Bob Croner, but he had a story. He was with the Hornet when she sank, but he goes, Bear, he says, you know, I had $400 that was in my sea locker that I lost when the Hornet sank. He said, but one of the raiders threw me his hat and told me to hang on to him for it because he wasn't going to need it anymore. And he goes, you know, I really wish I had that hat back because he would have liked to have given it back to the raider had the raider still been with us at the time. But the guys took off. They went and they attacked. They bombed the 5 different cities. All the aircraft successfully completed their missions. Some aircraft shot at some Japanese Zeros. One of the aircraft was getting really, really low on fuel, so it made a run for Vladivostok, Russia. Of the 16 aircraft, all but that one were either lost because of crash landing, ditching in the ocean, but only the one aircraft was salvageable. Once they left their targets and were heading for China, there was a bad storm. And usually, the way the wind patterns run, they would have had a headwind. But on this particular evening, divine providence, whatever you want to call it, the winds had shifted, so these guys had a tailwind that night. And that's what got them as far as they did. And they got as far as they could. They jumped out. Some of the guys crash landed in the ocean. Aircraft number 7 kind of landed in the surf. But of the 16 aircraft, on that night of the raid, 3 raiders lost their lives, either by bailing out or drowning after they ditched. So on the night of the raid itself, 3 of the raiders lost their lives that night. Wow. Aircraft number 7, and there's a book out, Christina, and a movie called 30 Seconds Over Tokyo. The book has been out since 1943, and the movie, I think, maybe a year or 2 after that. Dave Thatcher, who is one of the raiders still with us, said that Hollywood did a pretty good job depicting the events of that movie. And the book, 30 Seconds Over Tokyo, was written by Ted Lawson, who's no longer with us, but it's a good book. And another book for your listeners to listen to, again, it's been out for a while, is by Colonel C.V. Glimes. C.V. is the Raider historian, and the title of his book is The Doolittle Raid. So if you read C.V.'s book and Ted's book, watch 30 Seconds Over Tokyo, I think your listeners can get a pretty good feel as to what the Raiders went through and what happened. And today, we have 4 Raiders with us. We have Lieutenant Colonel Richard E. Cole, retired, Lieutenant Colonel Bobby L. Height, retired, Lieutenant Colonel Edwin Saylor, retired, and Staff Sergeant David Thatcher. And those are the 4 gentlemen that we still have of the 80 Raiders.
I'm just really, what's really coming out for me is that I don't think all of us understand the sacrifice they took up. You mentioned that this was the first aircraft carrier takeoff from an aircraft carrier for airplanes. I didn't know that myself, and that is a tremendous risk. To think that these guys knew that, hey, this has never been done before, we're going to do it on the fly because we have to.
Well, they tested it over off the coast of Norfolk to see if it could be done with the B-25, but these aircraft, they weren't laden with bombs and fuel, so they did do it. They could see that it could be done. But these gentlemen who took part in the raid, they had never done it before.
Wow.
And the Navy had been flying aircraft off of aircraft carriers for many years. These are Army guys. They use nice, grass or concrete or asphalt fields, not a pitching deck with where now you see the deck and the sea and now you don't because the deck is going up and down.
Oh, my gosh. I have to tell you, Brian, that really scares me. I saw a documentary a couple years back where they actually showed Navy pilots landing in the night with pitching, rolling seas on an aircraft carrier, and they showed it from the perspective of the pilot. And I was like, I would never fly a plane if that's what I saw out my window.
Yes. And my brother was in the Navy, and he was supposed to be flying on S-3s, which was like a sub kind of tracking aircraft. And I was all excited because I was looking forward to a Tiger cruise on the big gray Winnebago, but he ended up going C-130s, and they don't fly C-130s off aircraft carriers, so I didn't get my Tiger cruise courtesy of my brother.
Well, Brian, tell us a little bit about the bill you're working on to get passed through the Senate.
Okay. The Senate bill has passed, Christina. It passed November 19th. I had 79 sponsors, co-sponsors. It passed with unanimous consent. So the bill is now over in the House. Anytime you get a Congressional Gold Medal, you have to have 2/3 in each chamber. So in the Senate, that is 66 sponsors, co-sponsors, and on the House, that's 290 sponsors, co-sponsors. It passed in the Senate, and I'm happy to tell you all, but any help that you all can do out there, I'll give you some information before we sign off. Today, I am only 23 co-signers away to having my 290 in the House.
Yay, awesome. Yes.
I can't sleep at night. I'm on pins and needles. I just want to get this done for these guys.
They deserve it.
They do. Other military groups, the WASP, the women who flew and tested aircraft, the Code-Talkers, the Navajo, and the other Indians who used their native language to communicate during the war in the Pacific, the Tuskegee Airmen, the 442 Nisei, these groups have all been awarded the Congressional Gold Medal, and I took it upon myself to think that this group of veterans I'd like to get it for them also. So I took it upon myself 2.5 years ago to start this process, and we're almost at its fruition. We are so close to getting it done, and not just for the Raiders who are living and still with us, but for those who have passed. This will help cement their legacy, and there's a great exhibit at the Air Force Museum down in Dayton, Ohio. The Raider goblets are there, and if we can get this medal to also be down there, I think it helps just the generations to come to learn and understand what these courageous men did on that day, April 18th, 1942. And again, if you understand history and follow it, we had a battle at Midway just a month and a half later, and the Japanese did not send all the assets to Midway that they wanted to because of the attack on their home islands back on that April 18th. And we won the battle at Midway. We sank the 4 Japanese carriers that day. And it was after that point in time, the Japanese did not take any more land in the Pacific, and they were fighting a defensive action ever since then. When the raid was first conceived, Pearl Harbor was devastating, the loss of life. Wake Island, the Philippines, our allies over in the Far East had lost cities. They had lost battleships and stuff. The Japanese were on a roll, and this attack got the Japanese maybe to rethink their war strategy, and it paid off in dividends, and we won the Battle of Midway. And the Doolittle Raiders had a huge hand in making that happen.
Now explain for the audience who might not know about that battle, what that was all about.
The Battle of Midway happened the first, I think it was June 6th, I believe, of 42, and we had broken their code, so we knew where they were headed, and we had a trap set for them, and they came down, and they couldn't find us. We found them before they found us, and we attacked and sunk their 4 aircraft carriers. We suffered losses, too. Our ships and our carriers were damaged. I think we lost a carrier, but the Japanese had so many seasoned flyers. They lost so many of their airmen that day that they never recovered from that.
Well, thank you for sharing that. That is just amazing what they did for us. And I'm really glad that you're almost down to getting all the votes you need. Tell our audience what they can do to help you kick it out of the park and get this done and get those medals awarded as they should be.
Well, what we'd like for the audience to do, if you go to, and if it's okay to give the Raider website, Christina.
Go for it. Yeah, go for it.
Is www.doolittleraider.com. And you'll find on the website, right on the front page, it'll tell you how to look up Senate Bill 381. Don't worry about that because we've already passed that one. You want to be looking at House Bill H.R. 1209. 1209. And you can click on there and you can see all the House representatives who have signed up. And if you don't see your representative there, please email, call, write. Let's fire them up. We're, like I said earlier, we're down. I need 23 more. And once I get those 23 more, we have our 2/3 in the House. We can move this thing along, and we can get this thing up to the President sometime next year to sign, and we'll start the process to get these guys the medal. It takes a little while for the medal to be made, but at least the law will be signed, and the Raiders and their families will know that it has happened.
Wow. For me, it just boggles my mind that it took this long for it to even end up into becoming a bill or being worked on. It seems like something that should have happened right after World War II without even thinking about it.
Well, you know something, Christina? I don't think people, these guys, they don't look at themselves as being heroes. They don't think that they were on a suicide mission. It's us people who think that they are, and they are heroes. But they just did their jobs. That's how they perceived it. So it wasn't until I started looking around at other people who have received the medal and other groups, and I just got the idea in my head, why not the Doolittle Tokyo Raiders? They fit the criteria for it, so that's how it all came about. I wish I could give your audiences all the different stories and anecdotes that these are great men. They're humble. They don't consider themselves to be anything but normal individuals. And for me, back when we used to have to do book reports, one of the first 2 books that I read as a child that the teacher says, you can go pick your own book. Usually, remember how your teacher would say, I want you to read this book and do a book report?
Yep.
Well, the first 2 books that I read were God is My Co-Pilot. It's about Robert Scott and the Flying Tigers, and 30 Seconds Over Tokyo. There was a company back in the day that they made kids' books, a company called Landmark, and they were all about American history and events and stuff, and it was put into kids' terms. So those were the first 2 book reports that I did because I was interested. And I had seen the movies, and I have just been enamored with history and World War II and these Doolittle Tokyo Raiders ever since. To be their sergeant-at-arms, to participate with them, in 1986, I got to sit down with Jimmy Doolittle for 50 minutes out in Las Vegas at an air show we were participating in.
Wow. How did that go?
Oh, it was awesome. And his wife, Jo, was there, and just a nice gentleman, answered my questions, and we chatted. He was almost like a grandfather, if you know what I mean, Christina. Just a nice, nice man. And again, I have been very blessed with what I've done the last 30, 35 years with the Raiders, the Flying Tigers, the Black Sheep, the Band of Brothers. I've been invited to different fighter group reunions, the 4th Fighter Group, the 56. I've been to Iwo Jima reunions, the Pearl Harbor reunions and stuff, and you get to know these guys, Band of Brothers. They become your friends, so when you lose one, it's almost like you've lost a family member. And with their ages now, most of our World War II vets, even a lot of our Korean vets, their age is catching up with them. Dick Cole, who was Jimmy's co-pilot that morning, Dick turned 98 in September, and let me tell you, he is just like the ever-ready bunny. He just keeps going and going. Ed Saylor is doing pretty good. Ed is getting up there. Ed's 94. Bobby Height is still with us, and I got to tell you the story about Bobby Height. 8 Americans were captured by the Japanese the night of the raid, shortly thereafter, and 4 of the captured raiders were able to return home. 3 were executed after a mock trial, and 1 died of malnutrition and just ill treatment. But 4 came home, and after 40 months of miserable conditions, no food, meager ration, it was bad. Bobby is still with us. He has some medical issues. He was not able to travel to the toast that the gentleman had last month in Dayton. But Bobby Height was a great man, and we had a reunion a couple of years ago, and they got Bobby up in the B-25 to fly it, and I'm helping him climb out of the aircraft, and he looks at me and says, Bear, he says, I don't remember those controls being that heavy before. And so it's just stuff like that. And Ed Saylor, another little anecdote about Ed, is he had to do an engine change. On the aircraft carrier Hornet, there was no equipment to do this because the Navy didn't have anything that big in their inventory. They had a jury rig, a way to take that engine off, get it down in the hangar bay, let Ed work on it and fix it, and then get it back up and run it and hope that it was the way it was supposed to be, because there was not going to be any test flight. So when Ed got ready to go, fortunately it did what it had to do, but had Ed not fixed that airplane, they would have had to push that aircraft overboard and only had 15 aircraft instead of 16. So remarkable things that these gentlemen did. And Dave Thatcher, he was injured in the ditching that they did, but he was the least injured. He saved his crew. He got his crew to safety, and Ted Lawson ended up losing his leg. They had a doctor went with them, Doc White, and the general said, that's good that you want to go, Doc, but he says, you got to qualify. So he had to qualify as a gunner, Christina, to be able to have a ride on this mission. And Dave Thatcher was awarded the Silver Star for his action, for looking after his comrades and stuff. So great, just a great bunch of guys. Some of the Raiders were shot down over occupied Europe and became prisoners of the Luftwaffe. Davy Jones and Tom Griffith, who we lost earlier this year, they helped the British dig and get rid of the dirt for the tunnels for the Great Escape. So there's just all kinds of history and stories. And General Jones, he started his career as a cavalry officer and ended it being in charge of Cape Canaveral when they put the Apollo 11 guys on the moon.
Wow.
So,
it's amazing.
Again, the Raiders, they did this mission. Dick flew missions, 50-plus missions over the hump in the CBI, China, Burma, India Theater, and then he became part of the 1st Air Commandos. They all had careers, and they all did things after the raid. And even today, Christina, I don't know if a lot of your listeners know this, back in 1963, the Raiders started a scholarship fund. So from 1963 up until this last reunion, back in April of this year, they have given scholarships out to students who are going to an accredited college in the into engineering, aerodynamics, that type of a degree, and they have offered scholarships. And over the years, probably $100,000 have been distributed by the Raiders. So even in their elder ages, they're still giving back to the communities.
With everything they've already given. And I know my uncle who served on one of the ships, I don't recall which one because he never wanted to talk about what he went through. He was at Pearl Harbor when it was attacked on one of the Navy ships. He was in the Navy. So I know he definitely would have appreciated and been very grateful for the Doolittle Raiders going out there and kicking Japan's butt for their attack on us.
At the final toast last month in Dayton, they had 2 Pearl Harbor survivors there, and one of them got up and says, "Thank you for avenging us."
Absolutely. Through our sergeant at arms for the Doolittle Tokyo Raiders. For anyone out there who doesn't know what that means, because I frankly didn't know what that means, what exactly does that mean? How did you come to serving this function?
Well, as I mentioned, I have been doing this World War II thing for many, many years, and I love it. And I went to one of the reunions, and I saw Tom and Catherine Casey. They are the Raider business managers, and they were moving some stuff around and having some issues. So I just went over and started helping. That's just kind of what I do. And so one thing led to another, and I would come back to the reunion and help out, and my wife Cindy would help. And so they decided that I had to have a title. I had to be part of the crew. So the Raiders decided they made me their sergeant at arms. And basically, hey, I'm a gopher, but it's a great gopher job. You help them, with the book signings and moving them around, looking after them, kind of being their security, making sure that they don't fall and trip on things, and just being there to help them and their families, make their lives comfortable when they're out doing these public events, reunions, signings, air shows and stuff. And it becomes a labor of love.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for doing this for them and helping to get this passed. I know this little push is going to totally put it over the top, and those medals are going to be awarded. And I know you also mentioned you're a super big World War II historian and buff, and you had talked to me that, and you already mentioned some of the great heroes that have come out of World War II, but is there any other particular stories that come out for you that you'd like to share with our listeners?
Well, I used to crew, it was called the Confederate Air Force, now we're the Commemorative Air Force, the B-29, B-24, and I've stood behind Paul Tibbets while he's been at the controls of Fifi, the CAF's B-29, and I was his aide-de-camp at many different events, looking out and kind of doing the same thing for him that I've done with the Raiders and Tex Hill, the Flying Tigers, some of the Band of Brothers. I've been able to meet Ira Ecker, who is the general of the 8th Air Force, Kurt LeMay, and even in Kurt's old age, he was still chomping on those cigars, barking orders. So I have been very blessed in my hobby, I guess that's what we could call it, to be able to meet these people and sit down and listen to them and talk to them, hear what they have to say before the history revisionists get a hold of things, Christina, and kind of change things up. You can, what's the old phrase, go right to the horse's mouth and get it from them?
That's great, Brian, because you're helping to really keep the history, the real history of what happened alive.
Yes, I've got a copy of Walter Lord's book, Day of Infamy, and I have over 250 signatures in that book, Christina, of Pearl Harbor survivors.
Wow, that's tremendous.
And I always try to ask them, I ask them, what ship were you on, or what air base, what did you do? And then I always try to have a conversation with them. I've even interviewed some Bismarck survivors and German aces and stuff, and a lot of the British guys. I said, this is just history. I love history. And unfortunately, you hit the nail on the head a little bit ago. There's a lot of people that don't know it. When my wife and I visited all 435 House offices and all 100 Senate offices earlier this year, we did get, and I don't mean this to be bad, but a lot of the interns and the people working the front desk just kind of looked at us like the deer in the headlights. They didn't know who we were talking about. And again, I don't mean that to be negative, but I don't know if it's always covered in school like it should be. I don't know how that plays out. But these are great men, great stories. All of our veterans and their legacies need to be out there. They need to be remembered.
Brian, I couldn't agree with you more. In fact, I remember from high school World War II, and the biggest topic covered, and I never heard of the Doolittle Raiders during high school at all, but what we really focused on was Hitler, and all the horrible things he did, which is great for us to remember. We don't want to forget what happened, but we can't forget the wonderful, amazing sacrifices by all the military and, all our allies and the Americans who went out there to kick his butt and get him to stop his horrible acts. So it's wonderful that you're able to do this. And I'd like to ask you, Brian, are you planning to consolidate all of the interviews and everything you have in history and put it together maybe in a book or some fashion or something?
Well, people have asked me to do that, and I look at myself as just being a normal guy. But in some cases, I've been a lucky normal guy. And I've thought about it, Christina. I just don't know if anybody would want to hear my ramblings or my impressions or whatever. I'm told that people would, and I've got a lot of it upstairs. The mind is still working pretty good these days. But one of my buddies went to an event where Colonel Cole was at, and he goes, "Mr. Cole," he goes, "you and I have a mutual friend." So Dick looked up at him and said, "Well, who's that?" And my friend says, "Well, it's Brian Anderson." And he's thinking like, yeah, Brian doesn't know him. And Dick looked up at him and says, "What, you mean Bear?" Because Bear is my nickname. And he came back and says, "You really do know him, don't you?" As I said, I have been blessed to meet a lot of these guys and to hear a lot of their stories, and I might do that someday, or maybe try to put them on some audio tapes just so they're out there, because there are some great stories. And when people like myself and when the veterans and their families are gone, if that stuff is not written down or preserved someplace, it's lost forever.
That's what I'm getting, and I really think you should step on it ASAP, because if you have all that wonderful knowledge that you've actually shared from the horse's mouth itself, I think it would be great for future generations to hear the truth. Because you know how it is. As you said, they're revisionists. People go out there and they say what they put into the books, into the schools, what they feel is, or they deem is most important, but it might not be what everyone needs to hear, especially the sacrifices our men and women put into World War II itself.
Yep. Shorty Mann, she was one of the Raiders. Well, he had a portable photograph player, and when he jumped out of the airplane that night, Christina, he jumped with his record player.
Aww.
And when he got to the bottom, all he had left in his hand was the handle of that record player.
Aww. Wow.
So it's just little antidotes like that. When Dick jumped out that night, Dick Cole, he didn't get hurt, but when he pulled the ripcord, he pulled it so hard he hit himself in the eye and gave himself a black eye.
Wow. Now, can I ask you, Brian, do the Tokyo Doolittle Raiders, have they written or put into broadcast a lot of their stories? Is it out there for people to find and listen to them tell their own stories, perhaps?
Well, there's a group in Washington, D.C., the American Veterans Center, and they have stuff. They've interviewed the Raiders over the years, and they have stuff that you can get from the American Veterans Center in Washington, D.C. The Raiders have been interviewed many, many times. There's a company called Sleeping Dog. They've done a 4-disc video program on the Doolittle Tokyo Raiders, and I don't know what it costs, but there's some great, great interviews with the guys in that CV set too, Christina. I think YouTube has some stuff. If you dig enough, there's good stuff out there. If you pick up the deluxe edition of The Great Escape, there's a section in there. The character played by Steve McQueen was kind of fashioned after Davy Jones, one of the Raiders who was one of the tunnel diggers. So there's all kinds of stuff out there like that.
Well, thank you so much. I'm so grateful you were able to come out and share this very important information with our audience. And again, everyone, please contact your representatives. We want to get those 21 votes. Is it extra you need? Or
23. I'm 23 away. More is always better, Christina, but once we hit the magic 290, then we have the two-thirds. But I would like to get this as many of the House reps on board as we can to show and honor these great American heroes.
Yes, and everyone out there is thinking, well, maybe they've already hit their number. I'm not going to worry about it. Like Brian just said, more is better, so just contact your representatives today in your state so we can get this out there and get these men who have really sacrificed for our country and for our freedom.
Well, Christina, I just want to say one thing. Just for all the listeners out there, please thank your veterans and go up and, if you have a chance to talk to them or your family members, if they want to, get their stories, but just let them know that they're appreciated.
That is a perfect way to end. It's great because not only that, what I was getting from you before is that you would sit down and listen to people. I think that's what people want, is to know that, one, they made a difference, number two, you're listening to me. So, yes, please, go out there today. Please let your veterans know that you are grateful for their sacrifice so that we all can have our freedom. And, again, thank you so much, Brian, for coming out here today.
Well, thank you for having me, Christina, and I thank your audience for putting up with me.
Take care.
Okay, thank you much.
For those interested in being a future guest on Savvy or in paid sponsorship, you can contact us at 718-713-2289 or at savvycentralradio@gmail.com. And remember, we want to play the episodes you're interested in. If you have a topic or guest you'd like to see on Savvy, please let us know. A special thanks goes out to Blog Talk Radio for picking this episode as staff pick.